Hi everybody, welcome along to another episode of The Dispatches. My name is Brendan Malone. It is great to be back with you again, and today I want to talk with you about the brand new James Gunn Superman film. I watched it over the weekend and I wanted to share my thoughts. My main hypothesis that I'm going to get to at the end of this episode is the question, does the character of Superman still work? And I think that's a key question in all of this. But before I get to that, I just want to start by sharing some of the things I liked and I disliked about this movie. Now, normally when I do these kinds of movie reviews and sort of looking back over a film and sharing my thoughts about it, I tend to start with what I like and then end with what I dislike. I thought I'd do it the other way around this time, trying to be a bit more optimistic and a bit more positive about these things. So I'll start with the things that I disliked and then I'll jump into what I liked, because there are some things that I really liked about this movie. For me, it's not a bad film overall. It's got some good points, some bad points, and it comes out overall probably generally in the plus column. It's a film that's enjoyable to watch and not terribly awful either. One thing that I thought was quite good about that in this regard is that there was not any major woke preaching. Now, the problem though I see with that is that that's just far too low a bar to set. If you're saying, well, the film is great now because it doesn't contain any overzealous woke ideology being preached at us, to me, that's not the bar. That is a bar that is set far too low. When you go into a film, you should expect some competent and I think engaging, escapist, mythologizing and storytelling, the kind of stuff that touches the big issues of the human experience and draws us out of ourselves, not just, well, thank goodness they didn't preach at us with a whole lot of woke stuff, because, as I said, that is the bare minimum that I would expect out of a film. That's not the high point. And the fact that it's become the high point in some people's minds, like this film and other recent films they've talked about in this way, it really does speak to the dearth of good storytelling that we have had over recent years and how bad the problem has actually got. But in saying that there was no woke preaching, there were definitely what I would call trite and limiting political references of the moment. And these political references, they kind of work in the moment, but if you watch this film in 15, 20 years' time, I'm not sure that they will actually carry the same cultural cachet and currency, and therefore the film, I think, will be a lesser experience for someone who's watching it in 20 years' time. Now, that's not true of good mythology. You can read something like The Lord of the Rings or even watch those films the day they're released in cinema, 10 years later, 20 years later, 50 years later, whenever, and they will still carry weight for you. They'll have meaning because they speak to the deeper themes of the human experience. They're not stuck in a time and a place. And some of the references in this film, I think they do suffer from that a bit. And why that's a weakness is because even though they've done this better than other recent films have, where they're just very, very unsubtle and they're like, do you get it? This is supposed to be Donald Trump, or this is supposed to be Russia, or this is supposed to be Elon Musk. This film's a bit more subtle in that regard, and it actually lets you fill in your own blank. But the problem is this, and this is one really big aspect of this film, is the characters, I think they're called the Bravarians, aren't they? Is it Bravarians or something like that? It's obviously a play on the word brave. And they're this country that's being invaded by it could be Russia. This is the thing about this moment. They've left you to fill in the blanks. So you could look at this more dominant power invading and taking control of another weaker power, and they are taking control of that weaker power for their own gain, but they're selling it to them as a positive thing. You could look at that and you go, oh, that's Ukraine, Russia. Or you could look at it and you could go, oh, that's Israel, Palestine. And you could insert your own current political event into that, and it becomes a placeholder for that. The problem with that, though, that I see is that particularly with this key plot point around the Bavarian people, there's no real weight given to those characters in the story. And that's something that really stuck out for me. It's like, well, why should I really care about the plight of these people? I don't know them. The film hasn't really introduced me to these people in any meaningful way. It hasn't developed them as characters or as like a character. At the very least, you'd think that maybe they could have given us at least one of these people and made them a central figure in the story. So we start to identify with this person and they become the proxy for the whole of the nation. And you identify, you sympathize, and you have an emotional connection with that character and therefore with their people as well. But they don't do that. They don't do any of that. And so this key plot point about what's happening to these Bavarian people, you kind of look at it and you go, well, okay, but maybe they deserve to be invaded. I mean, no one deserves to be invaded, but you know what I mean? You look at it and you go, well, maybe they are the bad guys. I don't know. I just don't really know. I don't have any emotional connection to these people. I don't really know enough of the backstory to actually know who's telling me the truth and who's not here. And so, I kind of don't really care about this key plot moment in the film. Now, the reason it works, though, is because in the current moment, you can insert your own political moment or current affair event into that. And that's what gives it emotional heft. So you look at it, and if you care a lot about Ukraine and Russia, you'll go, oh, that's Ukraine and Russia. And all of that emotional weight of that real world event carries with you into that part of the film. Or you might look at it and go, oh, that's Israel-Palestine. And all of that emotional weight carries with you. But in 15, 20 years' time, when things like this are no longer happening, those particular plot points, they won't carry the same heft for people because they won't be bringing those things to them, and they haven't developed that aspect of the story enough to actually make us want to care about that key moment. And that is a weakness in this film. So even though it doesn't have woke preaching, there is still a bit of an issue there with the underdevelopment. It's not enough just to not have woke preaching. You've got to have more than, political references of the now and superficial stuff. You've got to have a development of virtue and a development of, good versus evil and the reality of different evils and human frailties that are timeless, they are classic, they are universal. And you sort of don't get that. That's missing in this film. By the way, for those who are wondering, I am looking off screen slightly here at times to check on my notes. So yeah, that's what's going on when I look off screen here. I'm not being distracted. I'm actually trying to just sort of reorientate myself a little bit. I think the other thing about this film that I'm not hugely enamored with is the fact that it feels to me now like a lot of superhero movies are basically, they're plagued, I would describe it, by a type and a shape, a formula, a way of being, if you like, that is essentially the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it feels to me like this was yet another example of a superhero movie that is, you'd have to say, is probably trying to break the mold and do its own thing. But it feels like we just can't escape that just yet. We're not yet ready to give up that addiction to the MCU. Everything is sort of referenced back, MCU. And to be fair, at its peak, it's not there anymore, but at its peak, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they made some great films. They really did set a bar. The problem was it created a bit of an expectation and I think a cultural addiction. And then that became the norm, that everything was sort of, like I said, there was a structure, a way of a superhero film being and appearing, and there's sort of like a formulaic visual. It's kind of hard to sort of explain, but I think you know what I mean. There is a look and a feel and a sense of what it means to be a superhero and how a superhero movie should work that the MCU created. And now this is yet another example of a film that I think is struggling to break that mold. And for me, it's something I don't like. And I think there are plenty of great ways. Like I think about a film like M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable. That is a phenomenal superhero origin story that's nothing like an MCU movie. Very different. Now, not every movie has to be like that, obviously. But it feels like these films are lacking their own original voice. And part of it is that cultural addiction we've got to Marvel. And this film still feels like it can't quite break out of that. And to me, that's really disappointing because to me, storytelling is about, it doesn't mean everything you do has to be original. And the reality is that in good storytelling, you're just going to keep touching on universal human themes anyway. But there should be your own voice in this. And it feels a little bit to me like, once again, this film is a superhero movie that doesn't quite have its own voice. And as a result of that, this film feels a little bit too cookie cutter. It feels like we're trapped in this Marvel universe, even when we're not actually supposed to be in this Marvel universe. And yeah, it's frustrating. Another thing that I didn't like, there's only a couple more on the list, but the other thing I didn't like about this film was there's a moment where we sort of get this almost worship and adulation of human frailty and human weakness. Now, I get it. They're trying to push back against the other extreme. We'll touch on that in just a moment because that's something I really do like about this film. But the problem is there's a tendency to then treat human frailty and human weakness, every human weakness, as if it's something almost worth deifying. There's a balance that's missing in this, that that in actual fact, we should look at our human weakness and recognize it for what it actually is, and also have a sense of our human dignity being a good thing. And what's missing here, the key component, is Christianity, because Christianity gives this to you. And when you are swimming in a culture that is moving in that current, that tidal current of Christianity, this all makes sense. And you get this in your storytelling, and you get a good anthropology. You get a good reflection in the film of what it is to be human. And so in the Christian vision of reality, you recognize that human frailty is a real thing, and it's the thing we all have to grapple with, that sin and evil and our own personal struggles and our own weakness is a thing, and that there are vices and weaknesses that we can adopt that are not good. So we don't celebrate the vices, and we don't celebrate weakness as being a thing to celebrate in and of itself. But then what we also do is we don't lose sight of the fact that we have an inherent human dignity, and it doesn't come from our weaknesses or our sins or our brokenness or our imperfections. Our human dignity comes from the fact that we are an imago Dei. We are made in the image of God. And that's what's missing in this. So when you don't have the imago Dei component, your anthropology is deficient. And so what do? You tend to say, like this film tries to do, well, human weakness is the thing that makes us good and unique, and it's something that we should sort of almost worship. And it's not correct. And that was frustrating. But it's not surprising. Current culture, bad anthropology, what do you expect? Storytelling is going to be a reflection of the culture and the ideologies and the ideological soup in which those storytellers are situated when they produce their stories. I also didn't like the crassness and also the darkness of this film. Now, the crassness of it, at times, it was a real letdown, not just because of the fact that this didn't seem congruent with the character of Superman that we have seen. Like, the bar really was set by the Christopher Reeve Superman. And there's something about this character and this story that feels like it should be accessible easily to families and to young people. And when you insert all of the crassness into these films, that really does limit the audience potential. And I think it undermines, in particular, this character and what Superman is. He is supposed to be this personification of goodness and truth. And when you've got a film that doesn't actually embody that and instead opts for these moments of crassness, I think you're undermining the very story that you're kind of trying to tell here. The second thing was the darkness in this film. Now, I know this is not as dark as previous superhero films we've seen, and I think of the stuff that Snyder has produced. I want to come back to that point when I circle back around and talk about the positives. But the fact is that this film is still dark. I think that we're so used to seeing very dark things and very cynical things that maybe we don't recognize what is a sort of a base and unhealthy level of cynicism and darkness now, because we're kind of like frogs boiling in the pot, and we've forgotten what that looks like. And so we just compare this to something that's really dark, and we go, well, no, it wasn't dark because it wasn't as dark as that one. But this film actually still has a darkness to it, and I kind of it sort of speaks to my central question that I'm going to get to in just a moment about whether or not Superman is still, a character that makes sense in the current culture that we find ourselves living in. There was one thing that really sort of stuck out to me in particular that they did in this film was when they turned Superman's parents into these evil divine beings who actually wanted him to dominate and take over the world. And I get it, it's a plot point and it's kind of interesting idea. No problem there at all with that. It's not the end of the world sort of thing. But there's a sort of cynicism and a nihilism and a darkness to all of that, it seems to me. And also the way they executed it, by the way, that kind of felt really clunky because they use Lex Luthor as the character, as the narrator effectively, to tell us this particular aspect of Superman's backstory in this movie. But in actual fact, Lex Luthor is not a reliable narrator. In fact, when this first happened in the film, it took me a while to really accept, they actually want me to believe that this is true, that this is not a plot, this is not a scheme, because for all intents and purposes, and according to Occam's razor, the most obvious thing to believe here would be that in actual fact, Lex Luthor was lying And so he had created a fake version of the message that he'd stolen from Superman's Fortress of Solitude, and then he was using this to try and bring him down, to try and get people to hate him, because that's what he's been sort of working towards previously in the film. But in actual fact, no, this is the message that his parents had given him, and there's this whole thing of, it's a very clever way of creating this juxtaposition between who Superman actually is and the man of character that he has become while he is on Earth. And there's all sorts of stuff embroiled in that, how his human parents really aided in that, and all that kind of stuff. All very interesting stuff, like I said. But the problem is the way they execute it. Well, I certainly didn't anyway. I thought, no, this is not real. I thought it's fake. It's clearly a fake, and we're going to find out that it's a fake. And then I realized, oh, it's not a fake. They want us to believe this. And to me, I feel like all you needed to do to fix that clunkiness was actually have Superman himself first discover the full message and realize, oh, this is who my parents are. And, they wanted me to dominate and take over this world. And then that message is leaked or obtained by Lex Luthor after that fact. And then oh, this is real. It's not fake. It's not a forgery. So to me, it just felt a little clunky. And apologies if I've missed anything here. It's, a film that I watched, and, as I want to do, I'm a bit of a dad now, and sometimes I nod off at moments in films. I'm getting to that stage of my life, so maybe if I've missed something here, but as I said, to me, it just, that felt like a very clunky way of doing it. And the one last thing for me that I thought was a bit of a disappointment, the payoff's really good at the end of this, but I was frustrated that it took a full 90 minutes or almost 90 minutes of this movie to actually humanize the main character. In fact, it was getting to the point where I thought, gosh, if this is the new Superman, I don't understand what people are, like when people are giving this film really positive reviews, I don't understand this, because this character just does not feel human. He feels awkward. He feels disconnected. He feels not like that childlike innocence that you have from, say, a Christopher Reeve character, but he just feels childish. He feels like a character you're not connecting with. The humanity that you and I know it just felt like it was missing from this character. And it took a full 90 minutes or almost 90 minutes before they actually humanize him. And when they do, it's very powerful. And it really does shift things around quite dramatically. But I don't know, for me, it just felt like a bit of an odd choice to wait all that time. Potentially, I don't know, some people might well have been tempted to walk out of the movie theater just thinking, I just don't relate to this character. If you didn't hang in there, if you are someone who did that, I don't know if anybody did, but if you are, then you did miss out on a really good payoff. But I just felt like maybe there could have been some humanizing moments that happened before that. As I said, the positive on the flip side of that is that the payoff was actually really, really good when they did humanize him, but it took them a long time to get there. Right, the three things that I really, really liked, and there's other stuff as well, there's little things. I don't really want to spend lots of time going through all of it, but there were three things that I really, really liked that stuck out to me, and I just want to mention today, and then I want to get into my main hypothesis, this question, does Superman really even work as a character anymore? So the first thing that I really liked was the fact that they actually explained, I think, in a very clever way, something that has always been a bit of a problem for the Superman character. And that problem is that he's Superman, and then he does this and puts his glasses on, and everyone goes, oh, it's Clark Kent, and they no longer recognize him. Look, different person. See? You don't recognize me. Different. Not the same. When in actual fact, that is just an absurdity. And it's always been this kind of long-running joke about the Superman character. Why is it that people clearly don't recognize this man who is obviously Superman just because he puts on a suit and tie and some glasses? And the way they explained that, there was this little moment of exposition that they had in the story that I thought was a very clever way of dealing with that long-standing question and sore point for some people, I'd imagine. Not for me, but it always has been a bit of a joke, a bit of a laughing point about this character. The fact is that these glasses in this version of the story, they emit they have a hallucinogenic quality. So what they do is they actually cause you, they're a tool in and of themselves, and they cause you to not see him and as he really is. And so you don't recognize him for that reason. That was clever. That was I love that. I really, really love that. Simple thing, but I thought that was clever. There's a few little clever moments, I think, like that in this particular film. One thing I really, really loved, and this is about that payoff. It took a full 90 minutes to get there, but I absolutely loved the fact that in this version of the movie, his adoptive human parents, that's Superman that I'm talking about, obviously, his adoptive human parents were very ordinary, working class, flyover state citizens of America. They were not like what we've seen previously. The temptation, I imagine, would have been to say, let's make them, all American, good old boy and a good old girl. And that's what they did. That's the Snyder approach. And so you got Kevin Costner as your dad, and I can't for the life of me remember the actress now. I can see her face and I know her name, but I just can't remember it in this moment. I want to say Laura Linney, but it's absolutely not Laura Linney. These two characters, and you understand why they've done it. They've made them sort of these all-American. That they are, what would you call them? They're like stereotypical sort of ideals. They're the idealism of the sort of the working class farming American type couple. I mean, Kevin Costner's your dad, for Pete's sake. There's something about that that sort of feels quintessentially iconic and allegorical. Anybody, who's going to represent the all-American in this moment, Kevin Costner's that guy. So it's got that kind of feel to it. But what I love about this film is they didn't do that. They resisted that temptation, and what they've got is genuine, ordinary, everyday working class people who are his mum and dad. And that, I think that really, for whatever reason for me, I loved the fact that they did that, because it did something that we haven't seen a lot of recently in films. The tendency has been, I think, in films to, particularly for liberal elites, to really look down their nose or to effectively forget that ordinary, everyday, working class Americans are real. When they do recognize them, they tend to be sort of condescending down to them. They're often blaming them for things in society. They are looking down their noses at them as if they are not as smart as they are, etc., etc. And this film does not do that. I thought that's what they were going to do at the beginning. I was a little bit worried by that when his parents are first introduced, and I thought, oh no, what's he doing here? When the payoff comes, it's really beautiful. And what I loved about it was you realize it was these real, ordinary, working class people, the forgotten people right now in the American moment, and I think largely in the West as well, who actually are responsible. And this is why, Superman's parents, it turns out, from his home world were actually quite evil and barbaric, and they wanted him to dominate and take over Earth. But his human parents, these ordinary, everyday, working class people, they're not Kevin Costner. They're not a representation of an ideal. They're just ordinary people. They were the ones who are actually really responsible, when you think about it, for saving humanity, because they imbued in Superman this goodness and this truth and the sense of virtue and moral character. And there's a really beautiful moment in this film when the payoff comes between him and his dad. And it was such a great thing to be reminded that these ordinary, everyday, working class people are the backbone. They are the hidden life who build your society, and what they do really matters, and they should be loved and respected. Obviously, unless they have bad characters and do evil things, but you know what I mean. That has been absolutely absent from the current cultural moment, and so it was really great. I loved that. I thought that was such a good thing to have in the story. And lastly, the other thing that I really loved in this was the clear critique and condemnation, I think quite strongly, of the Nietzschian Übermensch sort of ideology. And this is important, I think, in this particular story, because Superman as a character, his name is drawn directly from that Nietzschean idea of the Übermensch, the overman, the Superman, the strong man who will actually take things by force and lead us forward. And Nietzsche, in his ideology, is very hostile to Christianity. He talks about Christianity being like a master-slave morality, because in his view, he doesn't just disagree with Christianity, he thinks it's morally evil because he thinks it's holding society back, because he thinks it's making us weak. And the reason for that, he thinks, is because it's just too obsessed with mercy and compassion and these other types of virtues. And he says, who needs mercy and who needs compassion and is always going on about those things? The slave is, because the slave is a slave. They are weak, they're enslaved. But you know who doesn't go on about these things and doesn't need these things? The master, the strong man. And so you have this worship, and he really, contrasts the sort of the current Western culture with the pagan culture, the pre-Christian pagan culture, where strength was worshipped and deified and idealized in and of itself. Whereas Christianity says, no, strength is a good thing, but your strength must be directed towards virtue. And if it's not, if it's directed towards evil, towards vice and your own selfish ends, then that is not a good thing at all. And you certainly don't adopt an end justifies the means approach. Well, I'm the strong man, I'm going to drag society forward, and even if I have to drop a few bombs to get there sort of thing, or I have to break a few moral norms to get there, well, at least we get a good outcome. And that whole Nietzschean thing is really powerfully put on trial towards the end of this film. It's a big moment. It's not a recurring thing in the film, but the moment, I think, really carries weight. That whole moment when Lex Luthor is dialoguing and monologuing about how, these people don't deserve this strength, and he's the one who will show them the way forward. He is the Übermensch in that character. And as I said, it's kind of important because Superman, the character, actually, his name derives from that Nietzschean philosophy. And it was really great to see that critiqued, because when I present to groups about understanding the current culture that we live in, I often say to them, if you really pressed me and said, well, who is the one philosopher or ideologue that has most shaped the current struggles and problems we have in the Western world? I would say to you initially, it doesn't work that way. There's actually a variety of different ideologues and ideologies that have all come together to shape the current moment. However, if you put a gun to my head and said, no, tell me, then I would say to you, probably you would say Nietzsche is one of the most fundamentally influential figures. And even if you might say, oh, but isn't it Marx and Marxism? Well, go back and look at Marxism, and what's Marxism really doing? It's trying to practically outwork in governance the Nietzschean idea of building, we are the new gods now. We are the supermen who will recreate the world in our own image. So yeah, Nietzsche is quite a pivotal character in this moment. And I think even good people are currently facing the struggle and the temptation to think that maybe, just maybe, the answer lies in taking a bit of that power for ourselves and using it for our own ends and not worrying so much about the means. And I think it's good to have a film that challenges that. So I really, really appreciated that. Which brings me to my key hypothesis. Does Superman as a character actually work anymore in the current cultural moment? And I'm not sure if he actually does work anymore. And I think this film is kind of trying to grapple with it. That's why it's a bit darker. It seems to me that this film kind of points to the fact that Superman as a character, as he is originally intended, like the concept of that character and as he is brought into existence as this fictional thing, he really is a character that represents a very different former era, where that era was not marked by widespread nihilism and cynicism that is one of the hallmarks of Western culture. And also on top of that, so like the reason I say that is because for the character of Superman, the whole notion of, truth, justice, and the American way, it's an optimistic, hopeful sort of beacon and siren song of something, that's good and that we should all be striving for. And that kind of makes sense in a culture where you're not cynical about the institutions and where you don't, when someone says to you, truth, justice, and the American way, you don't think, oh my gosh, they're about to invade another country on a false pretense and do all sorts of harm, or they're propping up a proxy war, or, their leaders are all lying to us. It doesn't work in that current moment. And as I said, that cynicism, that nihilism, because he's the exact opposite of that. And this film, I think, knows that. It understands that because it's trying to grapple with it. I don't think it quite gets this bit right, but it is clearly trying to grapple with it. There's that moment where Superman talks about the idea that his sort of very hopeful and at times even naive optimism and trust in people, he calls it the new punk rock. And clearly that's them acknowledging, yeah, the culture is definitely not going where this character wants to go. And like wider culture in the West is just, it's not in that place at all. And the whole sense of identity as a people, like our national identity is broken down, trust in the institutions is broken down. And then on top of that, because the other aspect of Superman, of course, is that he is a divine being. Effectively, in the context of a human Earth, that fictional character is a Christ-like character. He's a divine being who has come to Earth, and for all intents and purposes, he hasn't really done this, but he has taken on human form. And so there is that whole notion of the Christian vision of the incarnation that's very pivotal to the character of Superman. Now that makes sense. So you could maybe get away with the question of this over a preponderance of cynicism and nihilism, if you still have a Christian vision of reality, which you probably wouldn't have that nihilism and cynicism, but you would still have that sort of sense of the incarnation and the God who becomes man, and the key thing here is a sacred transcendent vision that we are all called to and which gives us hope and draws us and propels us forward. That's broken down in the West as well, as we've abandoned our Christian faith. And so the whole notion of a character as like an expression of the incarnation, the God who becomes man and takes on human form, the whole notion of a sacred transcendent moral life and a vision that we are all called to and called to strive to live out in our daily lives, all of that's sort of broken down. So that's all missing. And so it really does mean that you've got a really hard task when you try and now produce films that are Superman movies in the current moment. And as I said, they know this, maybe this is the new punk rock. This is them really trying to push back against what they know is a massive tsunami that they are trying to push back against. And to me, it sort of points to the fact that maybe, like I've had this theory for some years now. In fact, you can go and watch some of my previous movies about this. I actually think that despite their deficiencies, the Snyder/Nolan verse, or whatever you want to call it, I think they got the Superman character right, actually. For a long time, people criticized that and said, it's too dark. That's not who Superman is. My hypothesis, I would always push back against this and say, well, sure, but they had no choice. Because if you look at that film, is it Superman Returns, I think it was called, the one that was the previous one that was made by Bryan Singer before we got this new Henry Cavill Superman. That was the most previous version of the Superman movie. And what that film is really trying to do, Bryan Singer's film, is it is trying to just bring back to life in the modern context the Christopher Reeve Superman. And it didn't work. It just did not work. You watch that film and you're like, it just doesn't work. And what's clearly not working here is this character. He is a square peg in a round hole. Doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit anymore culturally. And the culture has moved into a place that's not good. And so that character doesn't resonate the same way anymore. And so therefore they had no choice, I think, really, but to go for the darker edge. Now, one thing that I like about this version of the film, James Gunn's version, is they've brought back this idea of Superman not just frenetically destroying the whole world. I think some of the criticism about the action sequences in the Snyder movie were a little bit overdone at times, but there is a valid point here that in those films, Superman didn't really seem to care too much about all the destruction and lives he was putting at risk. In this movie, clearly they are course correcting on that point, and that I think is more consistent with the Superman character. But what I think the previous movie got right was you actually had to really humanize him, and I think also grapple with those, the cynicism, the nihilism, the darkness of a collapsing culture. And I think they then leaned heavily into the whole notion of the incarnation. It's pretty clear that they're really leaning into that idea, Superman as a type of Christ-like figure in the world. This movie doesn't do that, it goes a slightly different way, and I think it really points to the fact that Superman as a character, like even in this film, they've had to give him a darker edge. This is not a recreation with some new actors of the Christopher Reeve Superman. That character, I think, I don't know whether that will ever come around to a situation where that character would ever come back to the way of seeing and understanding Superman. Instead, there's this darkness, there's this grittiness, there's all of these other, the nihilism, the cynicism has seeped in basically, because it feels to me like you've got no other choice. And I'm not convinced actually that the Superman character actually carries that currency, because when you think about it, what's missing here is that sense, again, like I talked about earlier, of that sacred transcendent call that Christianity gives to us. Like this Superman feels like when he's talking about maybe this is the new punk rock, it doesn't feel confident. It's not like a character telling you the truth and saying, nope, these people are wrong and this is the truth. This is a character who's sort of like trying to maybe convince you that, yeah, maybe this is the new punk rock. That's what it feels like. The reason why, and also this current James Gunn Superman, I think he feels a little bit childish at times, whereas Christopher Reeve's character had a childlike innocence about him, but he never felt childish. He felt like a character who was confident, who was clear, who had a sense of mission and purpose, because he knew that what he was doing was good and true, because he understood things like virtue. Effectively, he has a sacred transcendent vision that motivates him, and that objective truth allows him to cut through all the relativistic nonsense and say, yeah, that's good, that's evil, and I can declare that with confidence, and I'm not a cynic. I can have a childlike hope and a belief that we can be hopeful about the future, and at the same time, it comes out of that really compelling call to virtue that's part of who he is. That's a cultural reflection of something, a culture that understands the Christian sense of virtue and the call to live virtue and the sacred transcendent horizon that gives hope to the world. That's missing from our culture now. And so you've got this strange situation where you've got a character in a film who is trying to sort of grapple with all of that, and his solution is to say, well, this is the new punk rock, but I don't think that's the answer. To me, that feels a little bit cringy. And it's missing something. And this is where you sort of get that whole deification of our humanity. Like human weakness is really held up as like this ultimate good in this film. That's not correct either. And so it's a great example of how the Christian culture, the loss of that in the West, has big ramifications for how stories are told. This is exactly J.R.R. Tolkien's point about mythology. Mythology that is good and true always comes from and points us back to the one true story, the history of God and humanity. And that's always what underpins everything. And so when that's broken down, what is it exactly that informs the little mythologies that you tell? And that's what we see in this film, I think, are grappling with this. And that's why I think in the current moment, they're really struggling to put a Superman together that actually isn't plagued by maybe too much darkness, or who knows how to actually speak to the current cultural moment in a way that actually makes sense and doesn't fall into these eras. Overall, good film, enjoyable, not the end of the world, but as I said, some thoughts from me about why I think we should think more deeply about these mythologies and some of the things about this particular mythological variation that's been given to us on the silver screen, this latest James Gunn version of Superman, why I think it's perhaps worthy of just taking a step back and thinking a little bit more deeply about. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth, and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you next time on The Dispatches.